I have to start by saying thank you very much, Karina, and thank you for coming as well to UCL. That sort of serendipitous moment of being here now is sort of, in a sense, what I want to talk about at some level. But there's a lot of things I want to talk about, but I really do want to say thank you to you guys for inviting me, and thank you to you for presenting to me such extraordinary insights into your world. I've sort of entered a new world again. This is something I find myself doing on a regular basis at the moment, of coming from an architecture background. I'm educated as an architect, trained in UCL, all the way through, actually. I'm sort of Bartlett boy is a sort of expression where you're effectively sort of trained or incubated, I think is a nice expression that was used yesterday, in the world of design and exploration and pushing boundaries and exploring ideas and taking them beyond the kind of logical reasoning and into sort of strange and esoteric and peculiar and avant-garde places. We're sort of particularly interested in taking ideas beyond their kind of imagined state in some ways. So there's this sort of background I've had that has been quite a privilege, but I think something we've been talking a lot about over the last few days, and I do agree with, is that design is not something you can teach. It's not something you can actually just present to someone and say, this is you can't make a designer per se, but you can create a space for design. You can create somewhere that design can take place. And I think design is very much an act of practice, and it's something that you have to engage with to be able to do. And I think that the process of design is the thing I'm really interested in. So I'm an architect, as Karina explained. I was qualified 20 years ago, but I've been designing buildings mostly in the UK, but also in America and Ireland and various places, working with teams of people. And the thing that becomes very apparent when you leave university is that you're no longer an individual. You're not there as the designer, just do this, because no one's going to just do this. You know, there's this process of persuasion, exploration, arguing, discourse, fighting, breaking, bending, and taking ideas through into the incarnation that they become. And I think that's the thing that I'll talk about in three packages. There's the past, present, and future, I think we've been presented with today. And in the past, I want to talk about incarnation and how ideas are infused into things. In the present, I want to talk a bit about the notion of the triptych and how fluid things are, and that we're always moving. Everything's moving, even mountains are shrinking. New grounds are forming. So we're always in a state of flux. Nothing is static. It's a fiction to think things are static. So we have to accept that and work with that and turn it to our advantage. So that's something to consider in the present, and to enjoy the present. You know, we're here now. It's like we've got the option of doing so many things. You know, you could leave if you wanted, or you could stay if you want to. You know, these choices are available to you always. So I think it's a question of embracing the present as much as possible. So most of this will be me showing you the work that I'm interested in. So I know you've had a heavy night. So most of it will be images, lots of images, sugar-coated. This is one of my students' projects from last year. It's a sugar pavilion, which entirely made of sugar. Lasted for 24 hours. That was the brief, 24-hour living light. That was the brief we gave the students. And we brought in a patisserie maker from Paris who gave us insights into how you construct with sugar. So I'll show some more projects like this. So just to give you an understanding again of this idea of incarnation, how you start to infuse ideas into things so that they take on a life of their own. And the last section is futures. That's a really interesting thing. What is the future? How can we prepare for the future? How can we design for the future? So I'm going to talk a bit about processes that allow us to be ready for any future condition. And again, use our design, use our understanding of how we might have an idea to adapt the way we work to embrace change. And complexity in particular. So just before I go into the slides, I was just trying to reflect on this idea of incarnation and how you learn design and how when the first moment of design might happen. And I think that to give you a sort of probably the most useful condensed phrases of how I learned design process, let's say, or design thinking perhaps, was with my driving instructor. I was about 17, I think, 16, 17. First driving lesson I ever sat in. And Cyril, his name was, from Wales. He was a 90-year-old soothsayer. He was almost like a kind of, Mr. Miyagi of the driving world. And he sat in the chair next to me. And I knew that he'd taught my granddad to drive. He taught my mum how to drive. He was going to teach me how to drive. So I'm sitting terrified next to this all-knowing driving instructor, and he said, Luke, he was Welsh, by the way, so, and I'm Welsh, so I don't sound it, but he said, Luke, look far and wide. So, okay. We'll start with that, far and wide, okay. And so we take off, first gear. How am I doing? Far and wide. So, and then it was second gear, third gear. You feel like the car is losing control, and you say, you might feel like you're losing control. That's okay. Keep looking far and wide. If you see some trees, don't look at the trees. Look at the gaps between the trees. And he's absolutely right. There's a lot of evidence that that if you're in a condition where the car's out of control and you're looking through the gaps, the car will go through the gaps. If you're looking at the trees, it's likely you'll go to the trees. So this idea of looking in gaps is something that struck me as quite important in this stage. And then he said, okay, tell me, Luke, what have you seen? Because we're still going down the road about 30 miles an hour, pulling out through of Dolgellau. And I said, a truck. And he said, very good. What's on the truck? And there was logs on the truck. So I said, trees. And he was, very good, yes. What does that mean? And it was this moment where I thought, okay, this means something. Don't look at them, I said. No. He said, what does it mean? And I was, just avoid it, And he was like, no, that's a log truck. So what are you going to do? He said, behind the log truck, there's going to be a crane truck. And sure enough, a few minutes later, a crane truck comes around the corner. Be prepared for that. And it was like, that's really interesting. There's a moment where you realize that you see something, it means something else. You see something, you can see a log truck, so you know that there might be very good likelihood. So he saw into the future. He saw a moment where he could actually say, okay, so the log truck is going to move the trees. And so he was prepared for that. So I think, again, that's design thinking. That's the ability to see the condition and understand what might happen next. It's still not an exact science, but it's something that allows you an insight into possible future realities. So seeing far and wide is my advice to you. I pass that on to you from Cyril, who's sadly no longer with us, but I don't think. He might still be teaching. So I just want to show you some of the work that I'm doing and some of the things we've done in the past, and return to this theme that I'm working around, which is this idea of tribal gathering. And I was fortunate enough to work in America in a company called BVH in Omaha, Nebraska, in say about 1995 to about 1998. And it was in a period of time where coming up to the millennium, a lot of people wanted churches. There was suddenly an influx of design for churches. So we were fortunate enough to, on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, there was a missionary, a reservation for the Oglala Sioux Native Americans, and they had a perfectly good Catholic church that was in the center of the reservation, which they liked very much, but it got struck by lightning, burnt to the ground. So they saw it as an opportunity. They saw it as this chance to rebuild. And the first conversation we had with Left Heron, his name was, the chief of the Oglala Sioux at the time, he came to us and he's saying that he liked this idea of the church and the cross. He kept saying, but we wouldn't call it a cross. He's saying, you've got these 2 points, probably easiest to draw it, where you can see that there's this idea where you've got this, And he's saying he kind of likes that idea of the cross, that tallied with him. He'd say, but we don't call that the cross of Christ, we call that arrows. Those are 2 arrows that sort of meaningful to him. So he's saying that the idea of orientation and that idea of having 2 points was really relevant, and so he liked that. So we sort of riffed with that and said, okay, the cross is really interesting. And he's saying, and he also liked the idea of the circle. So we were sort of playing with this idea of the circle. Doesn't look like a circle, but it will do in a second. Because it was this idea of the teepee, the flag for the Oglasu was actually 8 teepees all in a circle together, but it was also that it's connected to the drum, which is the center of the powwows, which is the sort of idea of the community. And he also told us a story about the sort of mythology of the buffalo woman who came to them at a very early stage and brought to them with the spiritual pipe, this idea that actually community is greater than the family. But the family is very important. So there's this order of family and community as being center to their thinking. And that the community was almost everything, the rocks, the stones, and so on. But within that ring was community. So they liked this idea of the circle. But he also said he liked the idea that because they were used to it, of a square. So it became this sort of almost motif of saying, well, these are 3 things that were already in the church anyway, because the Catholic Church is laid out with the nave and the cross and so on. But we said, well, why don't we just expand that? So we just took that as the plan, basically, of the church, and then built up from it this, do the corners, sort of almost dome-like church, but with a cross that was a spire at the end. So this is a fairly confusing drawing, but I can see that we can start rubbing some lines out, get some idea what's going on. And then there was the spire above the cross, so there was this sort of area where you could exist underneath. And so the whole design was this sort of semicircular ellipse almost around this cross that was originally there, and they liked that. So it became something else. It was still the church from Christians' perspective. It was still the teepee from a very much community gathering area, and it became this sort of connection. And it was a very award-winning building in the end because it had all of these things, and that was a motif that we could use within the design of the altar, within the design of the elevations, and so on. And so anyone going to that church would see it in this 2 ways of seeing things, but the same thing. And that's very much what I'm involved in at the moment of working with architects and engineers, is that we're working in a way where we're saying almost the same things, but just slightly different terminology in so many ways. And you just start saying, well, we'd call it this, you'd call it that. So this idea of sort of seeing the same things, but having slightly different meanings, just means we're just adjusting, we're changing and adapting and finding common ground. We're also breaking things as well in each of the different departments. So it's an exchange. There is things that you're sort of saying, okay, well, this will change and that will change. But there are these moments of adaptation. So this is this idea of multiple meaning. Now, that changes again, of course, when you go into the next level of design. I'll get up to here. So before we go forwards, I'm going to go backwards. And I think this is quite often the kind of idea of what this course is that I'm been involved in for many, many years. Of the Polymath, this sort of can do everything, and there's this quote, which sounds so contemporary today: to develop a complete mind, the study of science of art and the study of art of science. Learn how to see, this is really crucial. Realize that everything connects to everything else. This is the kind of Polymath idea. But this is sort of snubbed today a little bit in terms of the idea of the jack of all trades, master of none. And I think that's a fair comment. That you can't be a master of everything. It'd be absurd to be a master of everything. Nobody can be a master of everything. So you have to develop your knowledge, but you have to do it in this pluralistic way, in a way where you develop one thing and another, at least 2. I argue 3. I think you need to get into a world of understanding 3 parts from different perspectives to be able to see how you can navigate through those spaces. So I think he was on something, Leonardo, there, but it obviously didn't fully translate. There was a miss there. So we fast forward to 1827. The first brick of UCL was put down in the centre of London, Bloomsbury. And the first professor of engineering, John Millington, was brought in to teach civil engineering. And UCL was very much considered the third university after Oxford and Cambridge, but it was an industrial university. It was based on technology and medicine and well-being and health, and all the vitality of the city should be connected to this idea of good life and how to create a good living. And embedded in the kind of idea of UCL is this this notion of health and well-being and so forth. So, and the first professor there was the application of mechanical and philosophy of the arts. Again, this sort of bridging both gaps, but no longer has anybody got that title anymore. It's very outdated, but it's still relevant. So we move forwards about 30 years to Thomas Leveson Donaldson. He was the first professor of architecture in the UK. He came up with this really, again, relevant quote, but just wandering in a labyrinth of experiments. He just wanted to create a place that was full of things that didn't work, extraordinary ideas, things that inspired. So he was very interested in serendipity and this kind of chance and how things might happen. But he was also quite a savvy guy, because he also set up he was the first person who made the RIBA the RIBA, which is the accrediting body for architects. So first you become the first professor of architecture, then you create an outside body to accredit you. Brilliant. And that outside body keeps talking to the inside body, which is saying, okay, both of you are doing it right, well done. So there's sort of a peculiar thing there of like how you actually accredit yourself and how you do it. So there's, and ever since, a curious relationship between the RIBA and UCL as well, and the Bartlett. So he was the first professor of architecture. And he was talking to a room full of engineers at the time, probably about this many, saying we need to go off and branch into a more exploratory and unpredictable form of exploration, because at the time the engineering was taking form as well. Now, fast forward another 30 years later, Alexander Blackie, he was the first structural engineer. So we're getting to terms today that we're familiar with, structural engineer. We can sort of understand that. So we've got an architect, we've got a structural engineer. And again, this sort of narrow and deep, this understanding of how things work and how you develop things through exploration, and deep exploration is very much in place. But connecting theory and practice, again, really relevant to today. That the things that are being explored in university have to be relevant to the outside world. Otherwise, there's a sort of, why are you doing it? So I think there's a really, and he was the inventor of the laboratory. So he was the first inventor of a kind of engineering laboratory in terms of how you might test things to destruction. We like doing that now very much, testing things to destruction. Fast forward again, so this is now 30 years ago. He was the professor when I arrived in the Bartlett, so I arrived in 92, and he just started, visionary man, who, he's a cheeky bugger. I can't think of a better way of describing it. Real deviant, you know. He's really goes into territory, so I say, whoa, okay, can you say that? It's you know, he's interested in ideas, but primarily as ideas on paper. Now, he's particularly interested in drawing ideas, and he's generated lots of extraordinary projects. He's also built buildings, so it's not that he's not building what he is talking about, but he's real interested in the beyond the possibilities. So he would tease the deviant particularly, and he was always interested, as long as it's interesting. If it's not interesting, that's it, go, no interest. So he created a powerhouse of architecture. For the last 6 years, we've been the second best school of architecture in the world. I've always said in the opening introductions of these that we will be first because of the course I'm running. I got a text this morning, we're first. It came through just this morning, funny enough. So, but it was, yeah, so QS, which is the world rankings for various departments, Bartlett School of Architecture first, finally. I'm not saying it's because of the course, but it is. So I think this idea of, because MIT always pipped us, I think because they thought that the Bartlett wasn't technical enough, so now it is. Now, where am I going? To today, to now. Bob Shield is the current professor of architecture. He he's a maker. He comes from the workshop. He's a real deep understanding between how things are made, what processes go into making things, and then how they can be produced. So he's experimenting with made things. Now that appeals to me enormously as well, because I spent most of my time in the workshop as well. And I think there's this sort of insight into visionary ideas and making. You know, that's a potent combination. So he's got this nice phrase, which is designing has become a liquid discipline pouring into new domains. So he's particularly interested in how it's affecting everything. You know, you can see it all around us. As we race into the Anthropocene, everything around us is built. So we have to be in that understanding of how things are made and where they've come from. So I just want to show you a video which kind of encapsulates the sort of idea of I'm working with this program, which is, I dub it the triple threat. So there's, within the three institutions, we've got structural engineering, which is CEGE, Civil and Environmental Geomatics group. They're the engineering department. Haven't spoken to them for the last 175 years. There's the Bartlett School of Architecture, which branched out 175 years ago. And then there's also IEDE, which is the environmental, so mechanical and electrical engineering as well. And they're a different subset as well that grew about 30 years ago. So they're three very, very strong departments, but they haven't spoken to each other really, but maybe in passing. But it's not really a sort of communicative thing. So we're bringing those three departments together. So I call it the triple threat. And the closest, and using an analogy which is going around a lot at the moment, are films. I thought it would be useful to show you a film. And in particular, in Hollywood, this idea of acting, dancing, and singing. You know, if you can do all three, it's still entertainment. But if you can do all three, you've got an edge. You've got the ability to, at the very least, you might not be a great actor, but you can see what a great actor is. You might not be a great dancer and so on. But if you can do all three, then you're in a strong position. So, can you play a video? You've seen it? He's doing everything, so singing, dancing, acting. Just give it a thing. I knew you'd all been out drinking last night, so I thought I'd give you a bit of light relief. So this idea of the triple threat, there's design, let's say. There's space for design. And within that, there's architecture. But it's not all architecture, it's part of architecture. So one of the things we've been really interested in is that we don't exclusively do design, but we do have to be designers. So there's a part of it, design in there. But there's also conceptually another discipline, which is structural engineering, and very much combined with it. I think the perception, we were talking earlier on that there was a bake-off, we're talking about cupcakes, and there was someone saying that they had this woven area, and one of the cupcake designers was a architect, and they said, oh, I don't know anything about structure. And someone said, surely they should know about structure. It's like, architects should know about structure, but they don't do math, you know. I didn't do math in my education. I should have. I did it up to architecture, but there wasn't much calculations. You don't do the calc. So that's immediately a kind of, don't you do that? You know. And that's one of the, architecture is starting to become marginalized, you know. Structural engineers have become marginalized. And the third circle of the Holy Trinity, if you like, is this environmental engineering. Those are the guys that got us together. 175 years there's been architects and structural engineering separating. I would argue it's the environmental engineers who said, you guys got to talk. This is not good. You know, we need to have the ability to work to get these things to resolve. There's much more pressing issues here, you know, climate change, really reducing carbon, understanding how to make beautiful places because it impacts on welfare and how you live. And so it's got to be a synthesized and homogenized and understood effort. It can't be this sort of thing, which is happening endlessly in buildings, and I see it now, where it's, you see the architect and the structural engineer have been arguing, and then there's the environment which is plunked in at the end, and it's all sort of not fitting with the scheme. So it's synthesis is key. So we've got to start to get that conversation going. So that's effectively where the course is. It's those 3 parts all coming together. These are the 3 parts in my alma mater. I've got 10 minutes, so I'll race through the next 100 slides. Believe it or not, I do have 100. This is the Bartlett School of Architecture. This is CEG, and this is the environmental design. It's also where I studied all my career, so I studied there for many years. I love this place. It's got so many good memories. That's the British Museum there. I spent many times there. That's UCLH Hospital. That's where my 2 daughters were born. So there's a real sort of, this is my homeland in many ways. But it's like a brain. There's so many different connected parts, but they're not talking together very much. So finally, these 3 are getting back together. It seems we're frozen. The big change, in a sense, is we've occupied a huge new building that's shared between architects and engineers in the Olympic Park. It's the E of Here East. It's vast. You can drive an Arctic truck in there. And it's full of kit. We're just making things in there. So it's got robotics of all scales. There's nanorobotics right through to medical robotics and Cougar arms, large-scale robotics. So there's research of the narrow and deep, both in medical and engineering terms, but also broadly speaking, students get the opportunity to be designing and making things. So I'm going to show you very quickly here the things that the students are making at the moment. So this is it. That's not a design studio. That's a design studio. That's what it looks like at the end. This is my design studio from a few years back. They're chaotic, messy places, you know. Things happen through doing things and breaking them and falling apart and finding out what happens. But there's facilities elsewhere. So it's all about making use of all these facilities. But we need students. So a big part of what I've been doing is trying to gather students. And one of the things I was very aware of is we were getting monopolies of students. Public school coming through, that's fine, which is great. I went there for a bit. But also there's a widening participation, which is this sort of inner city areas that just don't get the chance to go to university. How do they know about it? So we've been going out to those places. India, we've got no one applying from architecture in India. Why was that? So I went to Mumbai and spoke to these guys and said, why are you not coming over to these courses? So I'm really interested in that cross-disciplinary, cross-cultural, cross-departmental human level where you start to bring in ideas that are subversive and different and strange and shouldn't be ignored. Whoever's not in the room is the person who gets the blame, so let's not go there. We interview everyone, so that's crucial. So we have that exchange and find out whether they're interested in being a part of something and what they want to bring. It's always interesting to find out what they want to bring. Always know who to ask. This is Don on the front desk. Anyone who comes to visit me, and I'd love it if you all came over. Anybody who wants to come over, just email me and I'll happily give you a tour of the place. Vice versa, if you ever want me to go and do things with you guys, very happy, just email me and I'll try and see what we can do. But Don's the center of the Bartlett and he will guide you around and understand things. You need to know everyone in the building at some level, but Don will be a conduit. Things happen all over the building though. It's a sort of free form. You can have a crit here, a studio there, you can eat, it's about cross-pollination. We go on tours, history and theory tours around London, that's a prototype. There's so many things happening in the city, so we give lectures in the city. This is one of the makers of the wheel talking. Actually, on the day that James Barwell died, unfortunately, we were going past, and Professor Michael Stacey was a good friend of his, so we were going past and doing a sort of eulogy to his work. And meeting the makers, going to the building, Serpentine Fillion, testing them out. Pin-ups, lots of drawings, abstract drawings. This was trying to draw landscapes of music. Structures, testing them, past the structures. Iterations, we do lots and lots of things. We're maniacs. There's a sort of process of continual testing and exploring and making and reflecting. Lectures, yeah, we do those. The review, which happened the other week, that was a very positive experience, There was so much information coming from the experts. That's what you want, You want to be confronted by the people who have done this many times, the masters, the people who've made every mistake, to give information, to give impact. So there is no such thing as a bad crit. testing things to destruction. Again, this is the sort of strength in the laboratory, so we can really find out precisely, quantitatively, with measurements, that things might work and how they work and why they might not work. We test real buildings now as well, so we go to the workers in the buildings and the people the punters who are there, and ask why it works. If it doesn't work, what doesn't work? Why doesn't it work? So that feedback loop of design is really crucial. We do it ourselves. We're all involved in the process. I'm still an architect making buildings. That's Dejan behind me. He's the mechanical and electrical engineer. He's writing lots of books and also still designing systems. Marek is a math teacher. He geocenters 0 for satellite systems, you know. So he's a really interesting guy. He also plays guitar. But there's this thing of, you know, how you start to bring these experts in and work with them on a kind of pedagogic level. So it's got to be that you're doing it yourself or part of that process. So get in a HVAC and go for a ride, you know. This was the part of the kind of experience of it. And the crits grow. This is one crit with a student of mine last year where, you know, there's internationally recognized architects on the panel. So it's all about that sort of critiquing till you get to the sort of refined thing. But we party hard as well. This is the Partloach Summer Show. Don't have a meltdown, I always say to my students. It's really important. It's quite intense, a lot of this. Go out, see that everything connects, you know. Meditate if you have to, relax, do what you need to do. But go out and see things. I won't talk about this because this is a bit dull. And it's the last day. But I'll talk about, just briefly enough to explain, this is almost 50% design studio. So the pink area is where we have, and we've dubbed it design practice. So it's about how you practice design, but also how you actually test ideas in a multidisciplinary approach. So we have a structural engineer, environmental designer, and an architect all working as tutors. So it's about that triptych again working, as well as then information coming in from engineering content coming into it, as well as history and theory, as well as practice. We even found space, which I'm thrilled to bits with, optional modules. None of the other courses have that. So it's like at the end you get the chance to go and do something that you really wanted to do in the first place. But we are hurtling to the Anthropocene, so we have to design beyond humanity, you know? This is something which was kind of claimed in the 60s and badly done, and has been sort of ignored somehow. But I think we are under enormous amounts of pressure as designers now to actually accept communities bigger than us. It's not about us somehow, it's about the community, and the community is larger than humanity. So there's this understanding now of how you design resilient systems that don't impact and destroy, you know, necessarily. They can at some level when you need to break things, that's fine, that's okay. But it's that there's a process of understanding the consequences of design decisions that we have to really explore. This guy knew it, Buckminster Fuller, absolute genius. No such thing as pollution, brilliant. He's not a denier. He would still fully agree that we're in global warming at an alarming rate. But it's nothing but resources we are not harvesting. So there's a subtlety there in terms of turning what might be a pollutant into a resource. So why are we wasting that? Why are we not turning things which are pollutants into things? You know, recycling, understanding how to adapt. So turning what might be fearful or wrong into a positive. It's always looking at ways of saying, okay, because we're ignorant of their value. I think that's a really crucial quote. This guy too, what a genius. Kept on trying. Trying is the first step to failure. He fails consistently, all the time. Great. What a designer. Well, this guy, this is interesting. I've put this up because I'm a big fan of Steve Jobs at some level, but I think he slightly got it wrong with this. He says design is a funny word. Some people think design means how it looks. But of course, if you dig deeper, it really is about how it works. I think there's truth in that. But that homunculus is how we see ourselves through physics. It's a feeling that we have. It's hopefully not how we think. It's also hopefully not how we see ourselves. But there's sort of how things look are important. How things feel are important. What we imagine, how we understand things is really important. So it's not always enough to just understand how something works. You need to go deeper than that and actually think about how things look as well or feel. So architecture is really about well-being. Zaha Hadid sadly left the world a few years back, and huge impact into architecture. I think that it's about the way you feel in a space, and I think this is really crucial. And it's about pleasure, you know. Engineer Ovaro, how am I doing for time? 20 seconds. Good, bad, indifferent. The art is arriving at a good solution. Engineering talking about art, this is really positive, you know, that there's this exchange between ideas where they come at it. Action without vision is only passing time. Vision without action is merely daydreaming, but vision with action can change the world. I think this is really crucial too. It's a sort of Japanese philosophy as well, but there's that, why would you do things without any vision, you know? If there's no idea incarnate, then it's can be described as a nightmare. And the best and most beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or in touch, they must be felt with the heart. Helen Keller, she was an author. She was blind, deaf, and dumb. And she wrote some extraordinary books. So this is where we are, the present. Leaping into the void. Klein. This is what I'm producing. Architects and engineers who believe this is possible. We teach them things. Drawing, I'll do this really quickly because we're running out of time. CAD, they're useful tools, but they're lies as well. They tell us lies sometimes. They're not always truthful. So they give us insights and information, and they're very, very valid, important things, but they're not the answer. So they become a way of getting rid of some of the lies. Language is the worst lie. I'm lying to you now. These are projects that students make one-to-one. I think this is really interesting. We're going into the different realm now of scale, so it's about testing ideas. This was using recycled materials, 24 hours of plastic bottles, all free, from UCL, in one day. That's something like 4,000 plastic bottles, and they were absorbing light into photovoltaic cells, using that light to channel into the space. That's what it's like when it's closed, and then in the nighttime releasing that light. So it's a kind of neutral payoff between day and night. These guys, they like tea. They like drinking tea, so they wanted the perfect cup of tea. So they built a wall which filtered air through the channels and up through the center. So it became about infusing tea leaves into the smell of the space. So it's about how you engage with the scent as well. These guys were interested in making a flexible space. So their idea was inspired by, how many of you might guess it? I was interested. Yeah, some like it hot. They were interested in that idea of the flirtatious space. This kind of like, what would it be like to be in a kind of thing where it's inviting sort of in from different angles? We go there. We go to very dodgy ground. It's okay. But I think there's architectonics here. There's interesting ideas. There's things of saying, okay, how do you adapt a space? And they're still being kept, sort of circles that allowed you to change and adapt the structure. This is a spiral staircase, didn't work, but it didn't matter. Using various point loads, you can almost see it in the model. They should have guessed at the beginning. So if it's not working in the model, it's a good chance it won't work in the These guys were the sugar ones I was telling you about, making almost like a Charlie and Chocolate Factory scale operation of pavilions. They went to town. All the bees in the area started coming in. It was like this real sort of, whoa, okay, hang on. But a beautiful pavilion, and it allowed you to see the transformation of light, so they were connecting it to the color temperature variance from day to night. But it drips away, so it's ephemeral, and it was about this idea of then collecting that ephemerality as a piece, which then they held up as a memory, a trace of it. I'll do these super fast. Other projects which they're doing to do with timber. These are chairs that some of the students I've worked with designing. Again, not being sure what we were doing, just playing with components, exploring what they might do. The theme was buoyancy, so we're trying to make neutral buoyancy. This is an ongoing research interest of my own, of neutral buoyancy, and develop this idea of a chair which would allow you to be buoyant, which you can kind of see there, you know. So there's this sort of sense of, there is a brief there, but it's like how you develop it into something else. This was a place to try and have a cigarette. So they were looking for the perfect cigarette spot, and they found it quite high up in a forest. So this was a way of getting up there. Or this is a student who was we're using eye tracking glasses to measure how he was working with the structure to see that he was actually doing what he was supposed to be doing, first of all, and turning him slightly into a robot, which we quite liked, and just saying, okay, where were the difficult points? Where in the building was he not working well? Then we go back into the design and be able to say, okay, well, you're having difficulty with that part, so we can redesign that area. So we're always looking for feedback loops. And you build a bigger one, and you sit in it for a while in the forest. Or just understanding these complexities and how they get built. This is another larger scale project. These are also 5-week, 10-week, 2-week, sometimes 1-week projects. This is over 4 weeks, snaking through the forest. A cocoon, which again you could sit in. Any of you like Game of Thrones might recognize this. We took our students to Iceland and then asked them to live in tents there. And the feedback we got, and sorry I'm slightly over, they apparently were built too well. That was the feedback. It was like, and it was really, yeah, it's built too well. They'd slept in it for the night, and they all woke up and they were drenched and actually a bit short of air, and they'd sealed everything. So all their sweat and breath has just gone inside, and they were out of air. So it's like ventilation. There's a thought, So next night ventilation. So do it by learning, doing. And that expanded. This is a paper house project, which I worked with some students in Greenwich. The world's largest paper house on the Maritime Vista, right in the centre. We needed to apply for a license because we were blocking an ancient historic view. And it was basically there for that long. The wind took it. We calculated that if there was more than a 14-mile-an-hour speed wind, then it would rip. We got 14-mile-an-hour speed. It ripped. It was on live TV, which is good. There's about a line of 8 students all behind, gutted. I was so excited. I was one of the only people that's like, this is brilliant. We've learned something. There's a point where it's going to not work. So next time, what do we do? Improve the design. New technologies, adaptive structures, playing around with those. This is a student in second year who was designing a skip garden. So these are all found objects. He was making an adaptive tea drinking space. That won an RIBA award, national one, which isn't bad for a second year. I don't know where his career will go after this, but Another student who's working with, again, neutral buoyancy, but this is a nod to Alexander Graham Bell, who was an early UCL alumni. So there we are. That's it. That's how you become an engineer, archineer. I'll present it to you first. This is my title for the people who might leave, archineers. I end it there. Thank you. I was going to give you plenty of time for questions, but I've eaten into that time. So.
I think we got some time for a few questions. So we had one on Mentimeter.
Looking for students?
Yes.
Questions? Shall I read? Oh.
Yeah.
I'll read this one and then...
They're saying that I'll read it out. They're saying that doctors can bury their mistakes, but architects have to advise their clients to grow bushes. What do you think of the role of failure in architecture design? How might it overlap with security context or war? It's a very good question, actually. It's come up. There's a friend of mine, actually. He's just finished a building. It's quite an amazing, very low carbon, very efficient, very well designed building, where he went to the quarry and he submitted a full planning application for the building, but all of the parts of the building were cheap bits of quarried material that he cut out of the quarry, and then he basically built a building that was a bit like Lego with large blocks of Portland stone. And it got built, and I like it personally. It's got a really interesting aesthetic. It's kind of, it's from the quarry in parts. It's smooth in parts. It's postmodern in many ways. There's a number of people who live around him who don't like postmodern. They're sort of, that's not what the drawings said. But the drawings, when he drew them, he didn't know what the quarried parts were, because it's planning. So it's a stage before you get to the end. So you can't predict that there'll be these parts. So they were saying, okay, well, those parts aren't in the right places. Now he's fighting a big battle now between the planners who are saying, you have to take it down. You have to, it's his house and it's his office. It cost him something like $4 million to do it. It's a brilliant piece of architecture, I think. But there are people there who are quite powerful who disagree. Now, that's at the nub of this. Is it good design or bad design? Don't know. I know which one I think. Who am I?
I have a bit of a nerd question
Good,
because
likewise.
as a civil engineer, I understand very intimately the very complicated relationship we often have with architects, and oftentimes adversarial, because you guys design stuff that just straight up doesn't stand up, and then we have to figure out how to make it stand up, right? So I guess my question is we can talk more later. From an education standpoint,
Not me, I don't.
what are you doing? And I'm really interested in this new making space that you have. What are you doing to kind of increase the interconnectivity and socialize that at the student level, at the younger level, like for collaboration, and really encourage between the architects, the engineers, and then the environmental folks, maybe from like, I don't know if you guys are doing, I'm sure you guys do LEED certification type design projects, right? The environmental standards. So like, what are you guys doing to encourage that interdisciplinary communication at a young age?
Very good question. Just before I came down here, I was mentioning that I'm trying to recruit from widening participation. We have this new organisation I've set up, which is called Accelerate, which is inviting in school kids to come in and see the space and work in there. So we give them 4 days where they make stuff in the studios. And they're taught by our students as well sometimes. So we get that kind of collaboration going on with the community. We're also doing an open day on the 13th of March it's called the B100. It's 100 years since the Bartlett has been a thing, which is, it's different from architecture, but the Bartlett. And we're having a big party on the 13th with a load of pavilions. And that, again, is open to the community and everyone in the area. In terms of research, though, and I think this is really important, is that there's this process of trying to test ideas within this place. So I think that there is, at the higher end, or the narrow and deep end, lots of projects that are starting to emerge from that, and those are cross-collaborative. Because it's all in one space, you can see it. So when I left, they were testing drones there when I left, and they were nighttime drones, so that was in the dark. That was quite interesting. And that was next door to a Boeing 747 wing, where they were scanning all the rivets to make sure that all the rivets were in place. And that was next door to the students making these sugar pavilions. So I think immersive spaces, I think the incubator idea is which was mentioned yesterday, I think it's a really good word for it, is something where you're exposed to this. And it may not be that you're directly engaged with it, but you might say, okay, something comes back. And then you can apply to do some research in there. So I think so long as the walls are down, we'll manage it.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Yeah.
When Leonardo da Vinci did his design, he designed weapons. Is this still in your community, or is this a no-go area?
I just realised. This jacket I'm wearing. It's. I'll show you. It's octopus paw. Now, in Japan, it's illegal. And I know octopus came up yesterday as a kind of one of the Trojan horse things. And I think there was this idea of, is it a weapon? I mean, what I'm wearing is a weapon in some senses because it's offensive. And it's not anymore banned. Miyake, who designed it, he's only done it because they just stopped banning octopus porn at that time. So there was a sort of... So we are interested in that line between when is something offensive or, causing offence. In terms of war machines, I don't know if there's been any projects yet, but there are sometimes design projects which are about the building being part of a defence system. There's quite a lot of those, actually. But one thing I should say on that front is that I've run technology and design in the Bartlett for the last 12 years, and I always say to the third years that every technical dissertation has to be different. They have to find something which is different, and there's been a number of projects, particularly post 9/11, which are related to the idea of defence. So there are a lot of students who might go into that territory and explore it at some level. They may come knocking on your doors. It'd be good if they did, I think. Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.